Quick question just about training. I think both you and Martin mentioned something with training. I just want to know if the training was standardized between the two teams, and if it wasn't, how that would have affected some of the measures you took.
Sure. So, what was roughly standardized is training times. Because that's easy. You can say, okay, you have the pitch for 90 minutes. But then asking two different coaches with different culture to kind of standardize training content is just doesn't even make sense.
We did ask them though to try and make this a light session, or if you want to do a heavy session. So we tried to specify a time, and within their training context, the type of training we'd like them to do. And that was generally matched because there was games in the Spurs, so quite often it was recovery for the day or two after, and then a heavier session.
One more quick question, since I have the mic. It's about the games themselves, because Rob, you mentioned that because they were playing the same team every time, some of the measures were reproducible. But another way of looking at it is because they played the same team, they could have adapted the coach could have adapted the strategy and the level of tactical and technical play.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, you might do less running because you actually know where your teammate, or so your opposition is going to go. But I think the Joeys were probably trying to win one as well. So I would hope that they were actually having a bit of a crack.
I have a 1,000 questions actually, but I'll try to limit it. One would be, why did you choose? What was the scientific reason for choosing 12 days and not like 4 weeks? VO2 max and so on increases over time. If you want to know it for a scientific reason, I think 12. I mean, red cell mass is supposed to increase even after 8 months. Finally, also I think, why would you measure HP mass when the very unique characteristics of high altitude natives is their diffusion capacities? Why do you have CO2 at rest? It's at maximum, or during exercise that's important. The influence of jet lag on sleep, on the sleep patterns, and so on and so on. Don't you really not need to go back and start from scratch?
They're all great scientific points, but I guess this was a very applied study, and the athletes were getting ready for competition. Hemoglobin mass, based on other data we'd seen and some more that we presented later, we were pretty confident we'd actually get it. We were obviously aware of your work, and we're interested to have a look at it with the technique in our own hands. And we did measure. Laura didn't actually give magnitudes, but you know, we'd be happy to go through those data with you. But yeah, outside the laboratory, it's very, very hard to control many of the factors we would like to control. You know, Bengt Saltine, Peter Bosch, Ben Levine, great scientists, all of them, have been unable to do this kind of a study. So there's lots of warts, lots of problems. Jet lag, yeah, it's going to be an issue. So our baseline in Santa Cruz would be affected probably by jet lag. So that if they decrease at altitude, it's relative to a depressed baseline.
I guess the main question was why 12 days? Why not 21? I guess 21 is better than 12.
Budget.
From a coach, I want to know.
Budget.
Yeah. But it's also completely unrealistic for a 21-day training camp as well.
You know, so scientific study.
Well,
no, it was a combination.
Not just.
It was.
Yeah. It's a real study.
Yeah,
real athletes under real conditions.
Just what would be the point of doing a camp of 3 weeks, which has a more greater scientific rationale, but knowing that any team in the world will be able to replicate our data?
Well, if you show big changes, maybe that will change.
So about 95%, no, let's say 98, 99% of the games until now were played when the guest players stayed less than 15 or 12 days at altitude. That this is a practical study, and we used this time frame because the players normally come in and go out within 1 day, and the rest does it within 3 days or 5 days. There's only one example. The team of Paraguay had an acclimatization period of 3 weeks, and they lost. That was 1 week before we started our study. So the practical aspects were most important, which is this time of 12 days.
Fair enough.
Thanks. My question is for Charlie. So about sleep. So thanks for the presentation. I think it was fascinating, and to get that work done is also impressive. So I just had a question with the arousal index that you presented. So, or your total arousals. But so it showed at baseline you're showing that there was like 80. So if they were sleeping 8 hours, then that would be the index that we know would be like 10 per hour, something like that.
Yeah.
So is that actually high? And if that's high, maybe it's going in relation to this idea of jet lag, or maybe you could just talk on that. Is that high for them?
Yep.
Yeah.
We think we tackled the jet lag problem in terms of sleep because we waited until the very last moment to get our baseline data. So it was about after 5 days. We also used a light exposure schedule with the players to try and facilitate that adaptation. The arousal index was probably slightly higher at baseline than we might see at home or in a lab, but potentially that's just due to the environment that they're in. So new sleeping environment, they're sharing a room with a roommate, so potentially it's not necessarily the altitude or those effects. So at baseline, yeah, probably they would have slept a bit better at home, but just the environmental conditions may have increased those arousals.
Hi, yeah, thank you for your talks, everyone. That's something I actually discussed with Ryan here after the sleep talk, and it didn't come up after in the next presentation. So since it's a combined effort, we were wondering if you actually analyzed the physiological data as well as the performance data, depending on the two groups of Australians, those who slept well and those who showed differences or perturbation in their sleep patterns that could have explained a few of the, I don't know, performance differences, or at least physiological resting heart rates, etc.
I can answer that one. Not yet.
Good.
Yeah. No. As I say, we're in the early stages of analysing this data, and obviously we've done that in isolation so far. But yeah, we do need to come together and look at the interactions between all the pieces of the pie that we've got from this study. So not yet.
I had a quick question about the fly-in, fly-out strategy versus the waiting strategy. So I guess the primary considerations are, on one hand, with the fly-in, fly-out, you're minimizing sleep deprivation or sleep problem issues, and then also you're probably potentially mitigating plasma volume loss that would happen acutely. And then on the other side, if you can have more days, you're going to have some sort of ventilatory acclimatization, which might help saturation. And I guess the question is, you know, everybody basically said you don't like the fly in, fly out. For the most part, would you say that's the case? In other words, would you?
What about the players?
Yeah, just watching the guys that, I mean, we've got various data, but just if you take it back to basics and watch them in the first game, like you can't run. So you've got to really change the tactics of the game, and then there's also, as was touched on yesterday, the differences in the flight of the ball. Within a few weeks of training, or a few days of training with that, you'll have erased those problems as well.
Sure.
So.
Do you think the loss in plasma volume versus the increase in ventilatory acclimatization, can you say one is greater than the other? How big is the plasma volume loss if you flew in and were there 2 or 3 hours? Is it going to be a lot different than if you were there for 24 hours?
We don't have the data during the match, and so I cannot say if this is 200 milliliters or 100 milliliters. So in the Australian team under resting conditions, we had a decrease of 400 milliliters after 5 days and about 500 milliliters after 12 days. So we strongly assume that immediately after arrival, there's almost no decrease in plasma volume. So there's no time. So what we have to mention is that until now there do not exist any study on physiological study which is published on this fly-in, fly-out issue. And there's one study. This is published as a report. Oh no, it's only a report of these doctors Eterovich and Kahiga, and we don't know the data, the exact data. We don't know the number of subjects. And so this is really the first study on this issue under standardized conditions, controlled conditions. So, of course, there are many questions remain left, and yeah, I think you have so many questions we could easily go to La Paz twice or 3 times again to continue with our studies.
David, do you have a question?
Yeah, well done. It's a massive study. Rob, this is to you. This is more on the GPS. Looking at games 4 and 5 with the Bolivians, there was a decrement in performance. And one of the things, particularly in AFL, we've noticed that sides that predominantly the stronger teams work a little bit less. Do you think there's a bit of self-preservation? And also, too, because they haven't lost a game, they reduce their workload compared to the Australians?
Yeah, I think that's entirely possible. I think the last game was 2-2 though. Is that right?
And
So.
the Australians were leading, they caught up during that game. I think it was more, being there and watching them, I think it was more a matter of the Bolivians maybe were starting to fatigue at the end of the training camp because they were in camp as well and training every day, which they don't normally do in their preparation, potentially, whilst the Australians were adapting to the altitude and overcoming that debilitating.
Yeah, so it's possible, and we can't rule that out. But again, it's part of the question that needs to be answered. So if you're going to a real competition, you know what's going to happen. So
could you just clarify? You know, the actual peak 5-minute distance that they covered, is that done simultaneously for both teams, or that's just at their peak?
They don't overlap necessarily, no.
And is it in the first half of the game, or is it the second half of the game?
The data that I've got here is just from first half of the game.
Right.
So I've only presented the first half data. Now, again, because it was a training camp situation, we didn't have all players playing the entire game. So I wanted to focus on where we had most of our data.
And just on the average velocity throughout the game, did you see a huge decrement there at all?
Haven't looked at it.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Congratulations, it's a huge amount of work. I have some question regarding the polysomnography. You did mention that you have 5 equipment, 5 machines.
Yep.
So how will you cope with the fact that, if I understand well, but you will tell me, when they come back from Santa Cruz to La Paz, some of them will be monitored for the first night and the other one for the second night. I think later on is not such a problem, though. And then the other question is, do we know if there is a big difference from at the first and the second night? You'll have to discuss that anyway for your data. And because by experience, being in many training camps, it seems that it might be already a better sleep on the second night.
Yep. It's definitely a limitation. There are only 2 of us doing the sleep monitoring, and we were limited by our equipment. There was only so much we could carry. So that was the decision that we made in doing one group on the first night and then the second group the second night. So obviously, yes, that's an issue. When we look at the groups, when we compare the sleep between the ones that we always did first and the ones that we always did second, there was no differences in sleep structure, but there were differences in the respiratory responses because we had the sort of people that had normal breathing and abnormal breathing. So the sleep between those 2 groups surprisingly wasn't different. But the only difference was you had some with abnormal breathing and others without.
And there's nothing in the literature about that? Or did you... I'm not aware of this
About
data.
comparing the first night to the second night? Not really. Most people either do it as soon as you get there and then 3 weeks later. So this is also, good because we've got a couple of measurements despite the limitations.
Thanks.
So you had the sleep band on, and you showed some the respiratory band. I mean, you had some data up there where you see clear fluctuations, and then not a flat line, but a little bit of this. So my question is: central sleep apnea versus obstructive. It doesn't go either way, I guess.
Most of the events, well, just about all of the events we saw was central ones. So that was a little bit of artifact that you could see. So in some, it's a flat line, which is a pause, so a loss of respiratory drive, if you like. So in all of the players, the events we were seeing were central events, not obstructive.
Did you do any measures of the apneic threshold? Did that change?
No, we didn't measure that.
And the last question.
Yeah.
The La Paz team. Do they have perfect sleep up there, or what's going on with these guys?
We monitored sleep with PSG in 10 of the Australians, but we also used activity monitors in the entire group, and we've only just sort of started analysing that. The main feature that's coming out of the sleep of the Bolivians is this, they spent less time in bed compared to the Australians, so that is the only sort of main difference that we're seeing at the moment. They just got less sleep potentially because they weren't in bed as much as the Aussies.
This is just to the panel. If you went back again to Bolivia, would you consider an intervention of oxygen supplementation at all?
Say that? I think this is too early. So we are at the beginning of such kind of studies, and so what we mostly have physiological data under resting conditions, and almost no data during standardized exercise. And the next step for us, for me, would be to investigate physiological responses as VO2 max or lactate threshold or some like these things. We could monitor the normal physiological response. And then the next step would be perhaps to use additional oxygen to improve sleep quality. Perhaps, in my opinion, sleep quality was rather good. So it's better than expected. And no, I think it's too early to do that now.
David, do you mean during the game or during sleep?
Both. I mean, if you could actually at night time, but also, I mean, obviously at half time, whether you're able to do that.
Maybe interesting because when doing severe acute mountain sickness, so inhalation of oxygen for 2 hours improves the situation mostly for longer time thereafter. And in my opinion, could be with a benefit to inhale oxygen before the game, perhaps for 30 minutes, 60 minutes, and then to play. It's an idea, it's a good idea.
The other side is, do you knock out some of the adaptation, which is also part of the process of the camp part as well.
Yeah, I was thinking more of, if it was a qualifier for World Cup, and obviously your main charter there is to win, so as long as it's done ethically, but yeah, that would be something to consider.
Very interesting question, and 2 people actually were on supplemental oxygen. A couple of the reasons for that, because they got altitude sickness. So one's
the researcher. Yeah, good study. Well done, guys. One intriguing result was that the 20 meters sprint performance was getting worse, and I would expect that it would be the other way around because of the reduction in the,
So
can you comment on this?
Yes, we just have to take, to analyze that into a different context. So about what you're suggesting is about the acute effect, and in our case, it's more, the data are more collected on the long term. So let's say if I just take first the points after 2 weeks of training, that makes definitely sense for me, because as you've seen during the games and as we've seen during training as well, they were just pacing themselves. They were doing training with less intensity. So they got a kind of a detrain they detrained their neuromuscular system because of the hypoxic stimuli. They just did less. And especially this specific neuromuscular quality, you need to stimulate them mostly on a daily basis to keep this their firing. So after a few days, they've just been detrained their neuromuscular system. I'm more surprised about the acute measure, but they were not done immediately when they arrived, but already 2 or 3 days after. So you already have kind of a few days. They train differently, or travel. I don't know. But for the last point, that's clear for me. It makes sense.
Sorry, just on that, Olivia, I would say maybe recommend to people doing altitude camps to possibly put in specifically in your training program some sprint work while you're up there to avoid that.
Which is also typically done by taking people down lower to do the quality work. So, and we didn't have that opportunity.
All right, one final question from Dave.
I do apologise, I've been hogging it a bit. This is to you, Martin. Obviously, it was interesting with the sprint test results. did you actually monitor any body composition over that period of time? And if so, do you think that because there was a catabolic effect or maybe a potential atrophy effect, there is a decrement in explosive power?
Unfortunately, we don't have body composition, but we have body weight.
And?
General, or body mass, sorry, body mass. They lost, all of them lost between 2 and 3 kilo.
So that could equate towards...
Could be some muscle, could be, it's more dehydration, especially. So with a change in plasma volume and then just muscle tissue, but more the water in the muscle, more in the body than just muscle, but we cannot, but yeah, definitely that can be, that can explain a bit the changes in sprinting times, definitely, yeah.
Okay, I'd like you to thank and we're back at what time, Olivia? 1:15.
Well, you got to keep doing stuff, you know. And the thing is,